UPN 45 and Digital Channel 26 KUTP Phoenix can be seen on these translators.
I'm Dolores Trafiano. One of the countless initiatives on the ballot in November is Proposition 203, which would totally abolish bilingual education in Arizona schools. Supporters of the proposition believe that bilingual education is a sham that hurts immigrant children academically while they're in school and economically when they enter the job market. Opponents of the proposition believe that bilingual education actually prepares students for the global marketplace. Right now, we're going to hear from both supporters and opponents of the proposition. Hopefully, will help you make a better decision about this issue when you go to the polls. And joining us in support of bilingual education are Arizona State Senator Joe Eddie Lopez and Tucson English teacher Sal Gabaldon and Tucson English teacher Hector Ayala and Glendale Union High Principal Margaret Garcia Dugan are also with us, and they oppose bilingual education. Thank you all for joining us. I guess we should say you oppose bilingual education, you support the proposition.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. And you support bilingual education but oppose the proposition.
That is correct.
Let's begin by having you explain to the viewers the bilingual program. Could you tell us a little bit, Senator, about what, how many children are currently in bilingual education programs?
The latest data that we have indicate that approximately 135 to 140,000 students have tested out as LEP in the state of Arizona.
Okay. Now, when the program has been around, what, for 30 years, there have been bilingual programs. Margaret, could you tell us what the initial goal of these bilingual programs, what was the goal initially for these programs? Was it to teach them English? Was it to maintain their culture?
Well, the intent of the law of 1968, which was for the Bilingual Education Act, was the initial intent of the law was to help poor Hispanic children learn English. Unfortunately, 30 years have gone by, and that is no longer the intent of bilingual education.
Okay, Senator, do you agree with that?
No, I certainly do not agree with it. That is still the intent of bilingual education, to teach our children that are limited in speaking English, to teach them academic English and get them competent as soon as possible in the use of English language.
Okay, so you really believe that that still continues to be the intent?
That is correct.
Okay.
Let me address the point of the intent, because I think there's one other complexity that a lot of people overlook, and that is the fact that Native American students have a very different intent for bilingual education. Among the tribes, there are at least 19,000 students in northern Arizona that are native speakers of Navajo as their first language. Among the tribes, the intent there is to preserve their native languages. Among many Anglo students, particularly in the Tucson Unified School District, the intent there is for students to learn Spanish because they're already native speakers of English. So depending on the population that you are dealing with, of course, you're going to have a very different set of goals from the parents and students that are involved in the program.
Okay, but if we were to say a primary intent...
Right. This is where we run into problems, when we start deciding for ourselves what the intent of bilingual education should be. The original intent of bilingual education is and has been to teach English to language minority kids. Now, if some school which tends to micromanage itself decides suddenly that because of their politics or their agenda is going to do something else with that money, this is wrong. This is a misappropriation of funds. This is calling bilingual education something that is not bilingual education. Teaching Navajo is not the purpose of bilingual education. Teaching Spanish to English-speaking children is not a purpose of bilingual education. The only purpose is to teach English to language minority kids. Somebody said somewhere back there 10, 15 years ago, no, we're going to do all these other purposes too, including inculcation of, you know, politics and attitudes with regards to Mexican Americans and Mexico and Mexican culture and all these other political issues. Well, what you run into is a balkanization of bilingual programs, none of which actually end up teaching English. This is why we're in the straits we are in now.
So,
I just want to say that allowing parents and local communities to determine what the goals of their schools ought to be is something that conservative voters in this country and liberal voters alike, whether Republican or Democrat, this idea that home rule, that people in a community should determine what is in the best interest of education for their students, not some federal government but rather local control, that's a very important concept in American education, something that we have defended in this nation for many, many years.
You're saying that each individual school will determine what the intent, or can and should determine what the intent of the bilingual program is?
Particularly since most of the money that schools receive for bilingual education does not come from the federal government, but comes from state budgets, and therefore local school boards and parents in a given community should have the right to say what is best for their students.
That carries at least an onerous tenor. If we decide that the neighborhood and the administrators in that school are going to decide what to teach in that school, you know, it could be something that has nothing to do with academics. Who's to decide? We have to have some kind of standard, at least a state standard. We're not opting for a national standard. And the only thing we're talking about is the language of instruction, not the curriculum per se. Now, the curriculum has been taken over generally by some of these administrators who feel that bilingual education is designed to teach culture and language, and that's not the case at all.
Another purpose of why Proposition 203 came about was because, number one, we believe that all students should receive equal opportunity and access to the curriculum that schools offer. And it is right now, we do not believe that is happening when students are not taught English from the onset when they enter a school. And we believe that is a skill that all students in public schools in Arizona and in the United States, for that matter, need in order to be successful and productive citizens of this country. And by not allowing them to become fluent in English, to me, is crippling students for our state.
Let me remind the viewing audience that under our current system, parents have a choice. If they want their children removed from bilingual education programs within 5 days, that principal must remove that child from that program. That child then must be given instruction in English immersion or whatever. We have that choice. What the initiative does is remove choice. It offers one program for all students, whether it meets their needs or not, and that is a very important issue. The other things, whether it's effective or how it's going to have an effect, I think we're going to be discussing a little bit later.
Let's talk about the proposition. Why don't you outline, Hector, exactly what the proposition
Well, with regards to the issue of choice, I'm not sure how much Senator Lopez really understands about how much choice has been traditionally given to the parent. I teach in a feeder pattern that involves all bilingual education elementary schools. I teach in the southwest side of Tucson, where the majority of the children are Mexican and where the majority of the bilingual education schools are. Only over the last year and a half, our organization has been personally responsible for having to either threaten or take lawyers down to the schools to have children removed of parents who have come in contact with us about their inability to remove their kids. We've spoken with hundreds of parents in the southwest side of Tucson, and again, dozens of times we've heard the story about their kids having been placed in there without their knowledge or permission. And when they go to these schools to get their kids out, they're not allowed. They're simply not allowed. And whenever they finally are allowed, they have their finger wagged at them and said, well, let this be on your head, because if these children don't learn English, it'll be your fault, and that sort of threat. So the issue of choice has been in the books, perhaps, ideally in somebody's mind, but in practice, the choice has been very scarce.